Hi all, I am absolutely delighted many of you liked the solid choice videos against 1e4, and you'll remember we chose the Sicilian Najdorf as one of the solid choices with black amongst other openings. Now here let's focus in on the Sicilian defense open variation today. So the open variation, the main line of the Sicilian, e4 c5, white usually plays knight f3, and here you have three major choices. So let's look at these choices fundamentally. d6 gives rise usually to the Najdorf. That's the Najdorf move order usually. You could also here play knight c6. So this is also a very, very popular choice here. And the other one is e6. It's with these three moves in particular which give rise to the 10 choices here, which I've based on an excellent wiki article on Sicilian defense, but I thought I'd also share my thoughts for things which have implications or not for solidity in each of the 10 choices. So okay, let's go with knight f3. So we're going into d6 territory. So the first primary solid variation, which has already been mentioned in another video, is the Sicilian Najdorf. So d4, white exchanges a centre pawn for black's flank pawn. C takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3, and now black plays a6. I believe it might have been Garry Kasparov starting to use this move a lot. The Scheveningen had a period of popularity with e6, but some variations, sometimes white plays bishop b5 in sometimes, and a6 avoids some of that and has other perks with this kind of high-class waiting move, and it's now become the most popular system. Its popularity has sustained. If you look at Kasparov and Fischer, where they shared opening repertoire, this is one of their shared points, the Sicilian Najdorf, but another has fallen down in popularity, the King's Indian defense. They both played, but it's not considered super solid today. A lot of the top grandmasters today do not play the King's Indian defense, but they do play the Najdorf. It has remained really, really popular. So a very, very interesting start position, and it's offering counterplay for the black player wanting to play for a win. So the Sicilian Najdorf still very, very popular today. So let's now have a look at another very important named variation. Let's go back to the start, and this second very, very important variation, which by some is not regarded as very solid in terms of king safety. It's the dragon variation. So knight f3, d6, so still with d6, d4, c takes, knight takes, and you still hit the e4 pawn, and it protects that. But here, not a6 but g6. So you play g6, so you're preparing to fianchetto your bishop. So it's actually, apparently, according to Wiki, it's been named by Fyodor Dostoyevsky in 1901. He noticed a resemblance between black's kingside pawn structure and the Draco constellation of stars. So very, very interesting name as well. And the most dangerous for black, which questions really its solidity, is when white plays bishop e3, 6 bishop e3. With this move, white is preparing f3, queen d2, castling queenside. This is a very important recipe, and you need to really know your stuff with the black pieces not to be blasted off the board, in fact. So I was hesitant calling this solid, but it is one of the relatively solid choices if and only if you really know your theory. Certain grandmasters, for example British Grandmaster Chris Ward, has been known as a major Sicilian dragon exponent. And apparently Magnus Carlsen flipped through and found some errors in one of Chris Ward's books many years back when Magnus was only about like 10 years old. So anyway, but the dragon, yes, it is a little bit dodgy in terms of king safety. I wouldn't say it's the most solid in terms of king safety opening in the world, but as in maybe solidly established as part of one of the main weapons of choice, especially for club players who want an exciting game with opposite side castling. It's the opposite side castling aspects which really make dragon games very, very exciting. So say we have bishop g7, we can enter an opposite side castling scenario after f3, black castles, queen d2 and knight c6, for example. Okay, so we have this position where white castles queenside, and so it's a very, very interesting position. Quite often with black, I would often play bishop d7, rook c8, knight e5, knight c4. I try and get rid of this bishop. Sometimes that's on the diagonal pinning that pawn, which makes h4, h5 more effectual. Sometimes it remains at home. Maybe white just tries for a quick attack. Often after h4 you're playing h5 as well. There's a lot of theory to know in this. It's very difficult to say anything too general, except that it's a very, very exciting game, and if you really love learning theory, maybe in the modern world, where you can train opening variations, this is, if for the theoretically prepared, it could be a solid choice. But be wary of king safety. Fischer did say that white just has to open up the h-file, sack and mate. He condemned actually the Sicilian dragon, so he didn't think it was that solid. Okay, so let's have a look at another kind of well-known Sicilian defense variation, and it's the classical. So the classical variation, e4 c5, knight f3, d6, d4. So it's part of d6 complex. C takes, knight takes, knight f6, knight c3. Now instead of playing a6 or g6, you're playing here knight c6. So bringing out the knights. You could argue, hang on, isn't this the four horsemen? No, the four horsemen, the pawn's on e6. There's a slight difference, isn't there, between the four horsemen which we've been looking at in recent days and this. In that e6 rather than d6. So there are four knights out though here in the classical variation. So black is deferring the development of this bishop. So if you had played g6, obviously the bishop's heading for there. Actually that defers development of that bishop anyway. But so we're really challenging the center early, and apparently the most common reply here is to play 6 bishop g5. This is known as the Richter-Rauser attack. So Kurt Richter's invention, threatening immediately to double black's pawns. So very, very interesting position. So after e6, you can get very, very exciting positions again where you have to be prepared for opposite side castling scenarios. And they are what makes the game, very, very exciting quite often. So say after e6, queen d2 is possible. And then white's going to castle queenside. So very, very interesting games can result from that, quite violent games. It's solid, as I say. If same with the dragon, if you really know your stuff, you should be able to generate some counterplay and not be too terrified of king safety issues. Okay, let's go for solid variation number 4 now. So the Scheveningen variation. So e4 c5, knight f3, d6 again, this key move d6, which opens up that bishop and discourages e5 quite often. So key move d4, c takes, knight takes, knight f6, encouraging white to protect the pawn with the knight blocking in the c pawn. But here, the Scheveningen, you play the move e6. So not a6, not g6, not knight c6, you play e6. Now, why would some people not consider this that solid nowadays? Why is a6 such an important improvement? Is it just because of the bishop b5 check stuff or the use of the b5 square? Not quite. I've had a very fun game in this with the white pieces, playing from this position the dangerous Keres attack. So because black has blocked in this bishop, it's no longer controlling that g4 square, and in fact this makes it possible for white to consider quite a violent move, g4 here. And I had a game against Murugan, who was 24-20 back in the Lloyds Bank Masters of 1993, which I really enjoyed. You might want to check that out. Trifon Gabriel against Murugan. So I played g4, and he played actually knight c6. This might not be the most solid choice. Maybe h6 is theoretically more correct. And after knight c6, though, g5, I had quite a fun game. After knight d7, h4, bishop e7, bishop e3, I had a really fun time here in this opposite side castling scenario. So queen d2, a6, I castled queenside. Knight takes d4, queen takes d4, b5, king b1, rook b8, and I played down knight e2, so getting the knight over to the king side, b4, knight g3, rook e8, queen going back to d2, queen a5. You can see that white's got this ready-made kingside attack here, and I look forward to playing h5 and g6, and I did so with great effect later, and won in 28 moves. So one of the dangers, though, fundamentally, of the Scheveningen is this Keres attack. So that's one of the perks of playing a6, because when you play a6, if we go back here, the move a6, if we look, is a waiting move, because it's making sure at the moment that white's not playing g4. So that's also one of the perks to kind of discourage the Keres attack. So 6, g4. So you might want to test your preparation against the Keres attack. So yeah, if a6, g4, you can just snap that off. So just to be clear, so e6, g4, the Keres attack is something you might want to prepare with h6, which would make this more solid. In general, you'd have an informational advantage over the opponent. So that covers 4 major systems with black, named systems, which are well known and established. Some kind of more solid than others in my view. So the Najdorf, the king of those systems as far as d6 is concerned. Let's go back though now and look at solid variation number 5. So knight f3, instead of d6, we're going to play here knight c6, and this gives rise, for example, to the Sicilian Sveshnikov. That's our solid variation number 5 pick, one of my favorites when I was a kid. So knight c6, so d4, and obviously it's been made a lot more popular with the usage by Magnus Carlsen in World Chess Championship matches. That's elevated it back again as a really respectable opening. So after knight takes d4, this is a very common move order. Knight f6, so encouraging white to block that c-pawn to protect here. Okay, and now you play this forcing move, e5. So very interesting variations. I've really enjoyed playing this with the black pieces. After knight b5, d6, you get this position quite often. Where here, for example, this is the old Sicilian defense, Sveshnikov main line as far as I'm aware, and white's got 2 major moves, bishop takes and knight d5, so you need to be prepared for both. But of course with the recent Caruana against Magnus Carlsen matches, there are also other variations to consider for white, like an early knight d5. So if you're well prepared, this is a really solid variation of the Sicilian defense, the Sveshnikov. I used to really like it because I thought it was an interesting name, Sveshnikov. Sounded kind of intriguing and dangerous. I like the idea of being a Sveshnikov expert. So let's go on to solid variation number 6. So again, this will be based on knight c6. So e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6. So what can we do here to create a major interesting variation? Well, after d4, c takes, knight takes d4, you don't play knight f6. Here, our solid variation number 6 is the accelerated dragon, so g6. So what would be the kind of upside of this compared to the normal dragon? The thing is, you haven't committed yet your d pawn, so in fact you could play d5 sometimes in one go if white's not careful. So that's a major difference. So for example, say white wants to play Yugoslav attack style and plays knight c3, and you play bishop g7, bishop e3, you haven't committed this pawn yet. And in fact, I think there's an entire book around this accelerated dragon, which if you read the books as well, it'll make you more solid. You know the ideas even more intimately. So bishop e3, knight f6, f3. So white's playing this as though black has committed to d6, but black can be tricky now and play d5. And this technically is equalizing, it seems. So it's much more dangerous for white. This d5 in one go is a major perk of playing the accelerated dragon, so white has to be pretty careful. So that's the accelerated dragon. Let's have a look at a solid choice number 7 now, the Kalashnikov variation. So e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4. And here, instead of knight f6, which forces or encourages white to play knight c3, blocking the c-pawn, you play, in fact, e5, knight. So the knight goes to b5, and there's very distinctive variations which can emerge here. You can either play knight, pardon me, sorry, in this position after knight b5, white hasn't committed to c4, so can inflict a Maroczy bind. That's one of the things which you might argue makes this, if not less solid, kind of uncomfortable, as if you've been sort of tied down. So if we look at this and say d6, white has the opportunity, because the knight's not blocking the c-pawn, white has the opportunity to play c4 with the dreaded Maroczy bind. So it's kind of pretty solid for white, actually, quite often. If white can prevent your strategic breaks, you have a kind of passive position. So here you can, though, play not knight f6, but you could play a6, kind of welcoming knight d6 check. So this is kind of interesting, actually, because you give up the dark squared bishop, but after queen f6, you do get a lead in development, but there are technical ways for the prepared white player to get an advantage. So it's a very, very interesting dynamic position here after queen f6. So what would make this solid is if you really knew the stuff, the key stem games with the black pieces. But be aware that if white also knows their stuff, it's not that solid. My good friend Kostas Karyonis has referred to this as a poor relative of the Sicilian Sveshnikov. Although it's kind of related, it seems to be a bit of a poor relative if you lose this dark square bishop in this particular fashion. But if you really know your stuff, it kind of contributes to the kind of practical solidity. For most of us, we're not going to be playing super grandmasters. We're going to be playing at the club against players that are not that brilliant positionally and tactically and do blunder a lot. Games after work in the evening, not even FIDE one-day chess. So, you know, if you get an exciting dynamic position with a lead development, often that's pretty dangerous for the player with the white pieces. So the solidity is a kind of in a practical sense here. So let's have a look at solid variation number 8, and let's go back, and e4, c5, knight f3. So solid variation number 8 is based on not knight c6 or d6, but e6. So e6. So this gives a priority to this dark square bishop, opportunities for the dark square bishop, and not so much for this bishop. And this bishop could, of course, go on to this diagonal later. It's weakening dark squares immediately. So what would be the benefits of playing e6 here, the Taimanov variation? So after d4, Mark Taimanov, named after Mark Taimanov, so knight takes d4, knight c6 here, challenging the knight, and the bishop has opportunities for going to c5 or b4 later. So its dark square pressure has been emphasized with this move, knight c6 in general. After knight b5, in fact, because we haven't committed a knight to c3 again, if, say, d6, white can play c4, so that's a version of the Maroczy bind. So anytime you don't force knight c3, this Maroczy bind could be it could be used to torture you, basically. So you've got to be a bit aware of that. But okay, the Taimanov Variation is not one I particularly experimented with, and maybe I should a little bit more, at least in blitz games. So knight c6 is interesting stuff. Let's have a look at solid variation number 9, the can variation. If anyone can variation, surely can. Okay, so the can variation, e4, c5, solid variation number 9, knight f3, based on e6. So d4, c takes d, knight takes d4, you play actually a6, so named after Ilya Kan. So you're preventing knight b5 and that dreaded Moxie bind like that anyway, but if white really wants, white could play c4, I guess. So in fact here, it seems the most popular fifth move statistically is bishop d3. And so for example, bishop c5, knight b3, you can actually just go back to e7 and say, well, the knight's not that well placed here. Or you can play bishop a7. Also, of course, white could have done, as mentioned, the Moxie bind on move 5 instead of bishop d3 to play c4. So a6, c4. Okay. So that's a very interesting variation, the can variation. Okay, solid variation number 10 is what we've been looking at recently. It's the Sicilian 4 knight. So e4, c5, knight f3. You do play the move e6. After d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3, knight c6. So the Sicilian 4 knights. So according to Wiki, it is a popular way of reaching a variation of the Sicilian Sveshnikov when you play d6, bishop f4, e5. We're back in a Sicilian Sveshnikov. But interestingly, and I find quite intriguing, I still want to research this, you can play actually bishop b4 to make this kind of distinctive, and it might seem a little bit like madness giving up the dark square bishop like this potentially. But you do get interesting d5, d4 quite quickly sometimes, as an upside of giving up the dark square bishop. Neural networks have taught us that when you give up a bishop of a certain color, you kind of get quite good excitement on the other color complex. And so that's why I would like to investigate this a little bit, this distinctive variation in the Sicilian 4 knights. And of course there's that Chessable course recently. There should be a link up there for that if you want to check out the 2 courses that have recently been promoted on this channel. So the Sicilian 4 knights is worth checking out. Now in Wiki, let's have a look at what I didn't put on the list from Wiki. The Sicilian pin variation is a little bit too dodgy to be considered solid by most standards, even club class standards, because I think people could really just with a little bit of preparation, guarantee kind of a big advantage. You might not like this, although it might be worth a punt at faster time controls as a sort of very surprise weapon. So you play bishop b4, the pin variation. So this isn't my list of top 10. This is the one I rejected. So bishop b4. It seems as though the forcing move e5 has got a lot going for it to challenge black. So after knight e4, you play queen g4. And it looks a bit scary to be encouraging this pressure on c3, but after knight takes c3, this kind of backfires a bit on black. You're hitting the rook now and you're encouraging a discovered check. Yeah, you do need to be theoretically prepared if you're playing white here, but this position here, and now you play a3, leads to quite a significant advantage, believe it or not. After knight b5 check, a takes, knight takes d4, bishop g5, it leads to a significant advantage for white. After queen b6, bishop h6, what are you doing with this rook? It's very difficult to defend this rook. So queen takes b4, defends the rook. c3 though, and yeah, I mean, it's kind of, yeah, you do need to know your stuff. After knight f5, c takes, knight takes g7, bishop takes g7. It's a long forcing sequence. And I guess most players don't really know this, but the key stem game here is Szabo against Magnus, 1939, and White's getting a big advantage there. Also, if we go back to move 6 on this, so here, e5, instead of knight e4, knight d5, so move 6, you play bishop d2 here, for example. After knight takes, b takes, the bishop drops back to e7, and then you still play this key move queen g4. It's interesting, this key move hitting that g7 pawn. So if black has to play g6, that's weakening the dark squares, and yeah, it's if castling, then you just run into bishop h6, so that's unpleasant. And in fact, here, as well as winning the exchange, as mentioned by Wiki, you can play h4. So this isn't particularly solid as far as those mentioned by Wiki. So there is definitely 10 what we can say is that the 10 that Wiki exposes are very well known. And my two most solid picks, as testimony to them, is Magnus Carlsen and other top grandmasters. Sicilian Sveshnikov has received great popularity resurgence. So that's one of my most solid picks, and which is great. So my childhood wasn't wasted. I had lots of printouts for the Sicilian Sveshnikov before it became hugely popular, like now again. And the other one is the Sicilian Najdorf. So Kasparov and Fischer, both Sicilian Najdorf fans, and it's the one opening that they shared that is still really, really popular today, unlike the King's Engine defence, for example, which they shared with black against d4, and that's not so popular and considered that solid today. But so the two most solid picks from this 10 are, in my view, the Sveshnikov and the Najdorf. Probably people put it in the other order: Najdorf first, Sveshnikov second. If you had to order the rest of them, if you don't like the idea of your king being hacked to death, probably you should avoid the main Sicilian dragon. Fischer really didn't think the Sicilian dragon was that solid. For the same reason, you might be transposing into the dragon from the accelerated dragon if white can somehow trick you. Maybe that's, if you're well prepared though, maybe that doesn't happen so much. So the accelerated dragon, I'm not entirely sure if you're really well prepared, if you're going to be hacked as much potentially as the dragon. But those two are a little bit dodgy fundamentally. If you look at a pawn structure perspective, when you play dragon formations, you're weakening your dark squares and you're encouraging opposite side castling. So it's a combination of structure and king safety. Whenever you fianchetto, you are committing to a certain weaknesses around your king as well. So those two might be two of the lesser solid of the 10. So the others, I would say they're worthy of investigation, especially if you're very well prepared theoretically. It's that which is really going to give them the solidity in practice, that you're not going to be beaten up too quickly on the chessboard, especially in our club matches. But yeah, as your opponents get more and more theoretically prepared, then maybe it becomes more and more a higher cost benefit to play either Sicilian Najdorf and be well prepared in that, or, as I say, the Sicilian Sveshnikov. On the other hand, though, the problem with playing Sicilian defence remains that there are also lots of anti-Sicilian defence variations which avoid the open variation, which you have to know about. So after e4, c5, for example, knight c3, closed variation, g3, bishop g2, and gambits, even Smith-Morrow gambit, d4 you need to know about, c3 you need to know about. So that there's a whole plethora of other choices available to white, which you also need to know about. But as far as the open variations, I think the two golden choices, as far as I'm concerned, it's pretty obvious to say, but I'm saying it: the Najdorf variation and the Sicilian Sveshnikov. based on recent Super Grandmaster practice. Okay, but there's 10 well-established choices in this video to check out and explore and experiment and have fun with. After all, chess is meant to be for having fun, not just winning games, but having fun in the process. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks very much.